The box appeared on my porch during the absolute peak of the autumn gale, a massive, unbranded wooden crate that looked more like a coffin than a standard delivery from any courier I recognized. I live nearly 4 miles from the nearest paved road, tucked away in a valley where the trees grow so thick that they seem to swallow the sound of the world, making the arrival of an unannounced shipment feel like a breach of a silent contract. I checked the shipping label, but the ink had been smeared into an illegible gray smudge by the driving rain, leaving me with nothing but a heavy sense of curiosity and a vague feeling of unease. I knew I hadn't ordered anything of that size, but the wind was howling with such a predatory intensity that I decided it was better to drag the crate inside than to let it be battered against the siding of the house all night. It took every ounce of my strength to slide the heavy wood across the threshold, the crate emitting a low, hollow thrumming sound as it moved across the floorboards of the entryway. Why was the delivery being made at 10 o'clock on a night when the local authorities had warned everyone to stay off the roads due to the flooding and the fallen power lines? I stood in the foyer, wiping the rainwater from my forehead, staring at the crate and wondering what could possibly be inside that required such a sturdy, reinforced frame. Just as I reached for a crowbar in the utility closet, the lights flickered twice and then died completely, plunging the house into a thick, suffocating darkness that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the storm. I stood there in the silence, my hands still gripping the cold metal of the crowbar, listening to the rain lashing against the windows and the distant, rhythmic creaking of the old oaks in the yard. But as the wind died down for a brief second, I heard a sound that didn't belong to the storm. It was a soft, metallic scrape coming from inside the wooden crate sitting just 3 feet away from me. It was the sound of a latch being turned, followed by a faint, wet intake of breath that made the hair on my arms stand up in a primal wave of terror. I realized in a heartbeat that the crate wasn't a mistake or a delivery at all, but a vessel for something that had been invited into my home by my own 2 hands. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs with such force that I felt lightheaded, while the sound of the crate's lid being pushed upward echoed through the empty hallway. I didn't stay to see who or what was emerging from that wooden box. I turned and ran toward the kitchen, my bare feet slapping against the cold tile as I searched for a way to secure the internal doors. I reached the basement door and ducked inside, locking the heavy bolt just as I heard the front crate fall open with a final, heavy thud against the hardwood. Who would go to such elaborate lengths to infiltrate a house in the middle of a storm, and what were they planning to do now that they were inside the perimeter? I huddled in the dark of the basement, listening to the slow, methodical footsteps of the intruder as they moved through the living room, their movements guided by a flashlight that sent thin ribbons of light through the cracks in the floorboards above my head. They weren't rushing. They were exploring, opening drawers and touching my belongings with a familiarity that suggested they had been studying my life from a distance for a very long time. The footsteps stopped directly above the basement door, and the silence that followed was heavier than the darkness. A predatory pause that told me the intruder knew exactly where I was hiding. A low, calm voice drifted through the floorboards, a tone so devoid of malice that it was more terrifying than a scream. I noticed you didn't check the weight of the box before you pulled it inside, which was your first mistake. I realized then that the intruder wasn't a common thief, but someone who derived pleasure from the psychological game of the hunt, someone who wanted me to understand the depth of my own vulnerability. I looked around the basement for an exit, but the only small window was reinforced with iron bars, and the only way out was back through the door that was now being rattled by a steady, persistent pressure. The intruder began to hum a soft, tuneless melody, the sound vibrating through the wood of the door as they leaned their weight against it, testing the strength of the hinges with a terrifying patience. I grabbed a heavy wrench from the workbench, my knuckles white as I prepared for the moment the wood gave way. But then the pressure suddenly stopped. I heard the footsteps retreat back toward the kitchen, followed by the sound of the gas stove being turned on, the clicking of the igniter repeating over and over in the stillness. A wave of panic washed over me as I realized they weren't going to come down and get me. They were going to wait for me to be driven out by the smell of gas or the threat of a fire. I had to act, so I used the wrench to smash the light bulb in the basement, ensuring that when the door finally opened, I would be the one with the advantage of the shadows. I moved to the base of the stairs and waited, my breathing shallow and silent, while the smell of unlit gas began to seep through the vents and fill the small, enclosed space. Just as the air became nearly unbearable, I heard the lock on the basement door click open, not from force, but from a key. The spare key I kept hidden in a fake rock in the garden. The door swung open, and the silhouette of a man stood in the frame, his face obscured by the darkness of the kitchen behind him. He stepped onto the top stair, his flashlight beam cutting through the basement air, but I didn't wait for him to find me. I lunged upward from the darkness, swinging the wrench with a desperate, horizontal arc that caught him across the shins, sending him tumbling down the wooden steps. I scrambled past him, my hands clawing at the stairs as I burst into the kitchen, slamming the basement door shut and shoving the heavy refrigerator in front of it with a burst of adrenaline-fueled strength. I ran out into the storm, the rain stinging my eyes and the wind tearing at my clothes, but I didn't stop until I reached the main road where a passing utility truck found me shivering and incoherent. When the police finally arrived at the house, the crate was gone, the gas had been turned off, and the basement was empty, leaving behind only a single, handwritten note on the kitchen island. It said, "Thank you for the hospitality. I'll be sure to choose a lighter box for the next delivery." To this day, I never accept a package that I haven't personally ordered, and every time I hear a heavy vehicle idling in the distance, I find myself locking the doors and staring at the empty space on my porch, waiting for the next wrong delivery to arrive. I never thought that the very technology one installed to make my life easier would eventually become the mechanical cage that would trap me inside with a predator. It started as a typical Tuesday evening, the kind where the silence of my suburban smart home felt like a luxury rather than a warning sign. I was sitting in my glass-walled home office, finishing up some late-night reports, while the automated lighting system dimmed to a soft amber hue that matched the setting sun outside. My house was a fortress of modern convenience, controlled entirely by a central hub that managed everything from the temperature of the air to the multi-point deadbolts on the front door. Why did I feel the sudden, prickling sensation of needles against the back of my neck when the first notification pinged on my phone screen? The alert was simple enough, stating that the front door had been unlocked at 10:42 p.m., which was impossible because I was the only person with the digital key code. I stared at the screen for a long moment, waiting for a second notification to tell me it was a system error or a delayed update from when I arrived home hours ago. But then, the silent house echoed with the heavy, mechanical thud of the deadbolt sliding back into the door frame, followed by the softest groan of a hinge being pushed open. I froze in my ergonomic chair, my heart hammering against my ribs so loudly that I was sure whoever was standing in my foyer could hear the rhythm of my panic. I pulled up the live feed of the entryway camera on my tablet, but the screen remained a void of pixelated blackness, displaying a signal-lost message that made my stomach drop into a cold pit of dread. Who could have bypassed a military-grade encryption system without triggering a single alarm or capturing a single frame of video evidence? I realized then that I wasn't dealing with a common thief who had stumbled upon my address, but someone who understood the digital architecture of my life better than I did. I crept to the office door, my socks sliding silently across the polished hardwood, and I pressed my ear against the wood to listen for the sound of breathing or the scuff of a boot. Instead, I heard the distinctive, high-pitched hum of the motorized blinds in the living room beginning to close one by one, sealing the house off from the street lights outside. It was a slow, deliberate process, as if the house itself was blinking its eyes shut, ensuring that no neighbor would see the nightmare that was about to unfold in the dark. I reached for my phone to call the police, but the screen was frozen on a high-resolution image of my own face, taken through the office webcam just seconds ago. Below my image, a text box appeared with a single sentence that turned my blood to ice. "I have changed the master override, and the windows are reinforced plexiglass, so please don't hurt yourself trying to leave." The realization that I was being watched through my own hardware at that very second sent a jolt of adrenaline through my limbs, forcing me to move. I grabbed a heavy glass paperweight from my desk, the only weapon I could find, and I cracked the office door open just an inch to peer into the hallway. The motion sensor lights, which usually bathed the corridor in a warm glow, remained stubbornly dark, leaving me to navigate a labyrinth of shadows that seemed to shift and stretch with every breath I took. I could hear a rhythmic tapping sound coming from the kitchen, a steady metallic clicking that sounded like someone testing the edge of a chef's knife against the granite countertop. Why was he staying in the shadows instead of rushing me? And why did he want me to know exactly where he was located in the house? I realized he was playing a game of psychological attrition, waiting for my nerves to shatter so I would make a mistake and run blindly into his arms. I retreated to the master bedroom, hoping to use the manual emergency release on the window, but as I reached for the lever, the electronic speakers in the ceiling crackled to life with a burst of static. A distorted, synthesized voice began to recite my daily schedule, listing the times I left for work, the places I ate lunch, and the exact minute I usually went to sleep. The voice was cold and hollow, stripped of all human emotion, making it feel as though the house itself had developed a homicidal consciousness. I fumbled for the manual release, but my fingers met only a smooth, flat plate where the lever should have been. He had removed the physical backups weeks ago without me ever noticing. I was trapped in a 3,000 square foot tomb of my own design, surrounded by smart glass that was rated to withstand a Category 5 hurricane. I heard footsteps then, slow and heavy, moving up the stairs with a terrifying lack of urgency that suggested the intruder knew I had nowhere left to run. Each step was punctuated by the sound of my smart speakers playing a distorted version of my favorite lullaby. The melody warped and slowed down until it sounded like a funeral dirge. I pushed my heavy oak dresser in front of the bedroom door, the wood screaming against the floorboards, but I knew it was only a temporary barrier against someone who controlled the very air I was breathing. Suddenly, the air conditioning vents began to hiss, pumping the smell of gasoline into the room. A scent so thick and pungent that it made my eyes water and my throat constrict in a cough. He wasn't just going to kill me. He was going to burn the evidence of his intrusion while the smart locks kept the fire department from entering the building. I looked at the smart hub on the wall, the blue light glowing like a malevolent eye, and I realized my only hope was to cause a total system failure that would force the locks into their default, fail-secure open state. I grabbed the heavy paperweight and began to smash the smart hub with every ounce of strength I had left, the plastic casing shattering and the wires sparking against the drywall. With every blow, the lights in the house flickered wildly, the speakers emitted a deafening shriek of feedback, and the gasoline smell grew stronger as the pump strained under the conflicting commands. I felt the heat rising in the hallway, a flickering orange glow beginning to dance under the bedroom door as the intruder realized his game was reaching its fiery conclusion. Just as the smoke began to curl through the vents, I heard a series of rapid-fire clicks echoing through the walls, the sound of the magnetic locks losing power and releasing their grip on the frames. I didn't wait to see if the intruder was on the other side of that dresser. I threw myself against the window, praying the failure had weakened the electronic tinting or the frame itself. The glass didn't break, but the frame groaned, and I used the dresser as a ram, shoving it with a desperate, primal scream until the entire unit popped outward. I tumbled onto the manicured lawn, the cold night air hitting my lungs like a miracle, and I didn't stop running until I reached the street lights where the world was still sane. I looked back to see my beautiful modern home engulfed in a silent, high-tech inferno, the silhouette of a man standing perfectly still in the upstairs window as the flames climbed higher. He didn't try to escape and he didn't scream. He just watched me, a shadow in the heart of a machine that had finally been broken. To this day, the police have never found a body in the ruins, nor could they find any record of the man who hacked my life. I live in an old farmhouse now with manual locks, wooden shutters, and not a single piece of technology that requires a battery or a signal. But sometimes, when the wind blows through the trees at night, I find myself staring at the front door, wondering if a simple metal key is enough to keep out a man who knows how to turn a home into a weapon. The most terrifying thing about a home invasion isn't always the moment someone breaks in, but the moment you realize they have been there for days, watching you sleep and learning the intimate rhythm of your life without making a single sound. It had been a week since I put my house on the market, and the Sunday open house had been a whirlwind of smiling strangers, muddy footprints on the carpet, and the constant, draining performance of pretending my life was as pristine as the staging furniture. By the time the last visitor departed at 5 o'clock, I was so exhausted that I simply did a quick walkthrough, locked the deadbolts, and collapsed into bed, never once thinking to check the crawl space or the deep, dark corners of the guest room closets. But as the week progressed, a series of small, inexplicable changes began to gnaw at the edges of my sanity, creating a slow-burning friction in my mind that I couldn't quite extinguish. Why was the shower curtain damp when I hadn't bathed since the morning? And why did the milk carton in the refrigerator seem to empty itself twice as fast as usual? I tried to convince myself that the stress of moving was making me forgetful, or that my mind was playing tricks on me in the silence of the empty house. But the logic didn't hold when I found a single, unfamiliar black hair on my pillowcase. It was a coarse, wire-like strand that didn't belong to me, and as I held it up to the light, a cold shiver raced down my spine, whispering that I was no longer the only resident of this property. The tension finally reached a breaking point on a Thursday night, when the moon was obscured by heavy clouds and the suburban street outside was deathly still. I was sitting in the living room with the television muted, listening to the house settle, when I heard a faint, rhythmic thumping coming from somewhere beneath the floorboards. It wasn't the sound of pipes or the house cooling down. It was the unmistakable sound of a human shifting their weight in the cramped, dark space of the crawl space directly under my feet. I sat perfectly still, my breath catching in my throat, wondering if the person down there could hear the frantic pounding of my heart through the hardwood. How long had they been down there, and how many times had they come out to watch me while I was vulnerable and unaware? I realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that the open house hadn't just been a way to sell my home, but an invitation for a predator to scout the layout and find a place to hide. I stood up slowly, trying to make my movements look natural, and I walked toward the kitchen to grab my phone from the charging dock. But as I passed the basement door, I noticed a sliver of light bleeding out from the crack at the bottom, a dim, flickering glow that shouldn't have been there. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, every instinct in my body screaming at me to run out the front door and never look back. But the curiosity was a heavy weight, pulling me toward the truth of who was sharing my sanctuary. So I turned the handle and pushed the door open just a fraction. The air that hit my face was stale and carried the faint, metallic scent of unwashed skin and old food, a smell that made my stomach churn with a sudden, violent nausea. I peered down the stairs and saw a small, battery-powered lantern sitting on the concrete floor, illuminating a makeshift nest of blankets and stolen clothes that had been tucked behind the water heater. Among the piles of fabric, I saw my own missing journals, my discarded mail, and a collection of Polaroid photos that had been taken from the shadows of my own backyard. My breath hitched, a soft gasp escaping my lips that felt like a thunderclap in the oppressive silence of the basement. The flickering light of the lantern suddenly went out, plunged into a darkness so absolute that I felt as if I had been struck blind. I heard the sound of a heavy body lunging upward from the shadows, the frantic scuff of boots against the stairs, and the wet, heavy breathing of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment of discovery. I slammed the basement door shut and threw my entire weight against it, feeling the wood shudder as the intruder hit the other side with a force that nearly tore the hinges from the wall. I didn't have time to lock it, so I grabbed a heavy kitchen chair and wedged it under the handle, my hands slick with sweat and my vision blurring from the sheer terror of the confrontation. The person on the other side didn't scream or shout. They simply began to scratch at the wood with their fingernails, a low, persistent rasping sound that was more terrifying than any threat could ever be. Why weren't they trying to break the door down with their shoulder? And why did the scratching sound like it was moving higher and higher up the frame? I backed away into the kitchen, fumbling for my phone to call the police, but as the operator's voice crackled in my ear, the power to the house was abruptly cut. The sudden darkness was like a physical blow, stripping away my sense of direction and leaving me at the mercy of a person who had spent a week learning how to navigate this house in the dark. I heard the sound of the chair sliding across the floor as the basement door was slowly pushed open, the wood groaning in protest as the intruder stepped into the kitchen. I retreated toward the living room, my hands brushing against the walls for guidance, while the sound of the scratching followed me, moving from the door to the drywall, tracing my path with a horrifying precision. I realized then that they weren't just trying to catch me. They were herding me toward the front door, where the locks had been tampered with to prevent my escape. I felt the cold metal of the front door handle against my back, and as I turned it, the mechanism clicked but refused to yield, the deadbolt having been jammed from the outside earlier in the evening. I was trapped in the foyer, the silhouette of a tall, thin man standing at the end of the hallway, illuminated only by the faint glow of a street lamp through the frosted glass of the sidelight. He held a long, rusted tool in one hand, and he began to tap it rhythmically against his palm, the metallic clink echoing through the hollow shell of my home. "You have such a beautiful life," he whispered, his voice a raspy, broken thing that sounded like it hadn't been used in years. I didn't wait for him to finish his sentence. I grabbed a heavy decorative vase from the entryway table and hurled it at the shadow, the ceramic shattering against his chest and buying me a precious few seconds of confusion. I dove toward the basement stairs, the very place I had just fled, knowing that he would expect me to run for the upper floors. I scrambled down into the cold, damp darkness, hiding myself in the narrow gap between the foundation wall and the storage shelves, pulling a heavy tarp over my body to mask my heat and my breath. I heard him enter the basement, his footsteps heavy and frustrated as he kicked over the lantern and tore through his own nest of blankets in a rage. He spent hours pacing the concrete floor, whispering to himself about the things he had seen me do and the secrets he had read in my diaries. I stayed perfectly still, my muscles cramping and my lungs burning from the effort of holding my breath, until the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the small basement windows. Only when I heard the heavy thud of the back door slamming shut did I dare to move, crawling out of my hiding place and sprinting toward the neighbor's house with the last of my strength. The police found the crawl space empty, the Polaroids gone, and the intruder vanished into the suburban morning as if he had never existed at all. They told me I was lucky to be alive, but as I sit in my new apartment, 3 cities away, I still find myself checking the shower curtains and the backs of closets every single night. Because I know that out there, somewhere, is a man who knows the sound of my breathing and the layout of my dreams, and he is likely attending another open house this very afternoon.